Daily Rambam for Monday, Dalet El Tavshin Pei, the 10th Perek of Hilchos Avoda Zara. So in the last Perek that we learned here, Perek Zion, that we learned here in person, we learned a lot of halachas regarding deriving hana, benefit from Avoda Zara. In Perek Ches, the Rambam dealt with when does something become Avoda Zara, when does something become nullified, when does Avoda Zara become nullified. Perek Tes, he dealt with interactions, business with idol worshippers, halachas relating to that. And today in Perek Yud, we're going to move on to the next topics, which are mitzvahs number 33, 34, and 35. In Hilchos Avoda Zara, Lamed Gimel, is shaloi lichres bris, lo ivde Avoda Zara, not to make some kind of pact, a treaty with idol worshippers. Lamed Daled, shaloi lachon alein, not to be nice, friendly, gracious to them. Lamed Hey is Shalayesh V'Baratenu, shouldn't live in our land, and we're going to learn about those mitzvahs here. So this Perek is possibly on the shorter side, but there are a lot of sharp halachas, as we'll see. So we start right away with mitzvahs number 33 and 34. So halacha aleph. Ein karsin bris lo ivda Avoda Zara. You don't make a covenant, a pact, a treaty, whatever you want to call it, with idol worshippers. Kadesh nasa iman shalom v'naniach oisam la'avdim. What would a covenant, what would a pact entail? What would it mean? It would mean that we want to make peace with them and let them continue worshiping their idols. That's what the significance of the treaty would be. What's the opposite of a treaty? Is war. So in other words, we're basically in a constant state of war against idol worshippers, and there's no way to end it because, as we're going to see, one of the ways of ending a war is with a treaty. That's not allowed. So we're going to see the other two options. Shnamar leisichra islahem bris. But this is a pasuk at the end of Parshas V'eschanan, near the pasuk that we brought in Perek Zion of Hilchos Avoda Zara, that you should destroy their mizbechos and their matzeves and their asheris. One of those psukim. So the whole context there is Ki V'yach Hashem will bring you to Eretz Yisrael. When his son, I'm going to hand them over to you. Hachim Takramaisim, you should destroy them. Leisichris Lahem Bris. And we're going to get to the end of the pasuk in a moment. And then the continuation is destroy their Avoda Zara. So this is all one big context. So do not make a bris with them. So what are the remaining options in that case? The only way to resolve this is either they quit the idol worship or we kill them. They get killed. Because, like I said, it's a constant state of warfare with no means for ending it in any other way. And now we immediately go on to the next mitzvah, which is the next two words in the pasuk. So we're going to see. V'asur l'rachem aleihem. And you can't have mercy on them. Shenam v'lei sachanim, those are the next two words in the pasuk. Now, what's the difference between these two things? So, I mean, off the top of my head, you could say that maybe Bris is with them as a nation, and L'rachim is on a personal level. But we're going to see that there's practical differences in what Leisachane means according to halacha. So, Fichach. So the Ram immediately translates what Leisachane means in halacha. So if you see an idol worshiper is lost, is drowning in the river, don't help him, don't save him. You see he's being taken away to be killed, some kind of death sentence, don't try to save him. However, the Ram says, but to actually physically finish him off, or to push him into a pit where he died, something like that would be prohibited. Because he's not at war with us. So first of all, So I'm gonna comment on that. I said this before. I just want to point out that it says Goy Avoda Zara. Now, if you're familiar with Svarim, so often you see that there's some kind of censorship. There's been Christian censorship for a few hundred years. One of the most common examples of Christian censorship is that you see the word Avodas Kechavim, or instead of a Goy, instead of just saying plain Goy, it says Goy, Avoda Zara, Akum. But here, this is not, just to point out, here, Goy Avoda Zara, that's specifically a Goy Avoda Zara, and the Rambam himself is saying that a regular guy would not have that din, as we're also going to discuss. So, now, when the Rambam says, La'abdu b'yoda, you shouldn't do, that's what Chazal call loy ma'ilin v'loy me'edin. You don't help him up, but you don't push him down. Something's unclear, because in the Reisha, it sounds like we're in a state of war. And now you're telling me that, he's not at war with us, so we shouldn't actually actively get rid of it, so bump him off. So, Now, if you said in the beginning, as some may say, that it's really only, that the whole pasuk of Lesichris is only talking about the 7 nations. I think in some prints of the Rambam, they actually played around with it in order to make it a little more palatable, the censorship that we're speaking about. They changed it, the Zionumais, which are, that way it's a prehistoric situation. But we're going with our girsa here, or if there's another opinion, so then you could say maybe the Reish was talking about the 7 nations, and this is talking about another idol worshiper, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So if we look at the Halacha Mishnah says, Ein Karsim Bris, the beginning of the Halacha, the Za'ayri Kshiyadenu Tkifa, Banu Eis Nuchamima, and that's when we're strong, we're going to war. Like it says in Hilchos Malachim, in Karsim Shem, the whole context there is that you're in the middle of a war. And the continuation, if you saw a guy, Leimailin, so that's Bisman Azev, Enyodenu Tekifa, so Loy Mailim V'Loy Meridin. So the Ein Karsim Bris kicks in when you're at war, when you're in that state, and Leisachanim kicks in when you're not at war, more like nowadays. And there's a lot of these halachas, there's more of it in the Rambam, in Hilchos Ritzeach, for example, in Hilchos Malachim, and actually at the end of the whole Perek, we're going to have a whole, like a sort of a Bamed Dvarim Amurim, where the Rambam's going to say that all this, in Kol Dvarim Elu Amurim, Elu Bizman, that the Yad HaGoyim Tekifa, so it's not even clear necessarily how far back that in Kol Dvarim Elu Amurim goes. So it's possible that it really goes back all the way to here in Halacha Aleph. Any din in this Perek that assumes that there are goyim that are idolatrous that are amongst us, not doing anything about it, the assumption probably is that it's not a situation in which we can control that. However, we will see maybe there are some details in here that are even referring to nowadays, so it's not 100% straightforward, but that's what we're going to have to say. Now, since the Rambam already mentioned the halacha of loy mailin and loy meridin, so now in the next paragraph in halacha aleph, he goes on to the halacha of mailin, of meridin v'loy mailin. When we said that you shouldn't shove him, that's a Gentile. But people who are Muslim, people that are handing Jews over to the Gentiles, and otherwise minimum apikursim, people who are heretics of different kinds. Mitzvah la'abdun b'yad u'laridin ad be'er shacha. So there actually is a mitzvah to completely knock them off and to get them down and to the depths of the pits, because they're causing problems, they're causing trouble for the Jewish people, and they're removing the nation from behind Hashem. He gives some examples. And he ends off Shem Rishon Yerkov. So bit of passion there from the Rambam. So Mitzayden. So I think Mitzayden probably is referring to the Masrim. The Masrim are Mitzayden, they're causing trouble, and I would say the Mesir Nazam is in reference to the Mimim and Apikursim. They're the ones who are removing the Jews. They're swaying the Jews from following Hashem.
The censor didn't get this one. The censor didn't get this one.
I'm sure it did in the standard prints. The Rambams we're using here already are uncensored. And I already mentioned this when we were talking about the Mesis. We brought it up that the Mesis is a specific framework with Beis and with Eidim, but there's this other framework for Meridin V'Leimalim without a Beis and without Eidim if someone's causing that kind of major trouble. And the Rambam mentions these examples. So these are examples from the time of Chazal, and those are also, of course, very large groups that caused a great amount of trouble. Christians were also mentioned actually in the previous Perek and Perek Tess. According to the Rambam, they're Avoda Zara, in his opinion, which the Ashkenazi poskim, of course, were not fully on board on. Regarding the terminology of minimum apikursim, when we get to Hilchos Shuvah, the Rambam gets into greater detail there about what's a min, what's an apikaitis. Once we're at it, we can ask, the Rambam is using these older examples from Chazal. What about groups that are more recent? Let's say the Karoim. The Karoim were a big deal in the time of the Rambam. They came into existence after the time of Chazal, and they were actually around then. So there's some places where you might surmise, the Rambam seems to imply that they're also minim, but there are other places where it seems like the Rambam, who actually had to interact with them and deal with them when he was in Mitzrayim, which is where a lot of them were, seems that when it came to dealing with them practically, the Rambam leaned towards being more lenient. Christian. I mean, there's maybe a debate about why Yeshua HaNotzri's original term was Notzri. Maybe it meant he came from a place. I mean, in English they say Nazareth. Yeah. I don't know if that's 100% straightforward, but obviously today, as a nation, as a group, they're called Notzrim in Hebrew. So that's considered a translation of Christian. Also here, it's not clear. Is this that I'm talking about when Bisman Sheyad Yisrael Takifa or not? Because we just ended off the previous paragraph in Halacha Aleph saying we're talking about Goyim, not Sheyad Yisrael Takifa. So is this also not? So Rambam is still saying we should take matters into our own hands? I think on a practical level, except aside from a few stories maybe about where they they killed a Musser, an informant who was causing a particular amount of distress, and maybe in Spain. Around the time of the Rambam, there was a period of time where the Jews in Spain had the ability to carry out capital punishment or stuff like that. There are some shuvas from the Poskim, the Rishonim in Spain about that kind of thing. I still don't think, though, that this was necessarily implemented on a practical basis too often.
Maybe Russian.
Maybe, but more about Muslim. Like I said, more about Muslim. You have stories more about Muslim. I'm saying more maybe a Muslim here and there, and less minimum up a person. So now let's get back to the previous topic in the previous paragraph, which is about meridin, loy meridin v'loy malin for a goy eved avodah zara. So if you're not supposed to kill, but you're not supposed to save, so what about healing? What about medicine? So in Halacha Beis, it gets back to that. Says Mikana Talamed from the Halacha we said about goyim. We learn also let up is eved avodah zara filu b'schar. So you can't heal an idol worshiper even for money. However, and this is of course back to clearly that here's Ram for the first time is saying clearly we're talking about a situation where it's not Yad Yisrael to keep us. If you're afraid of them, or there's just a general concern that's going to create animosity, it's not a specific fear from this individual, but overall you're afraid about the ripple effects. So then, so then you could do it for money, but you shouldn't do it for free. Can't do it for free. And then Rambam concludes, there is a concept of a ger taishav, which we're citing as the opposite of a goy eved avodah zara. So a ger taishav, someone who accepts the Sheva mitzvahs, etc. So we actually are commanded to mailen. If you see him, you're supposed to save him. So the same way you would save him in that kind of situation. So of course you would also be able to heal him for free. Same principle.
What do for free?
You'll be able to heal a ger taishav for free, just so you can save him if you see him in trouble. No, so ger taishav is someone who rejects avodah zara and accepts the design mitzvahs in a formal process. You're asking what about someone who's neither this nor that? Well, he's going to mention it also at the end of the Perek, and it's just he's talking about refuah. So if he's saying that you can't heal like this, he has to tell you the exception. So you can heal every Zara, but you could if it was a ger taishav. Just giving you the full picture about the refuah. Now the question is, what about non-idolatrous Gentiles nowadays? So it's not clear. It doesn't seem like you can actually formally have a din ger taishav. The Rambam is actually going to say it pretty clearly at the end of the Perek that you can't formally, there's no process for accepting a ger taishav. But it also sounds like as long as he's not actually serving avodah zara, shouldn't that be enough? And that seems to be what the Kesef Mishnah also seems to understand from what the Rambam said, that it would any Gentile who's not idolatrous, who's not officially according to halacha serving avodah zara, you should be able to heal. Of course, there's actually a very practical ramification here because the Rambam himself, what was his career? What was his vocation? He was a doctor. Now,
He healed the king.
we know.
The Sultan was a monotheist. He was Arab, but he was
Right. So first of all, as we've discussed in the past, that Rambam surely didn't consider Muslims to be eved avodah zara. He has a whole tshuva saying they're not eved avodah zara. So for sure, b'schar wouldn't be a problem even without Eva. And never mind if there is Eva. It would be interesting to see. The Rambam describes in one place what his medical practice was like. Interesting to see if he was particular to take money, or maybe did he not think he was necessary to take money if he didn't consider them to be over the avodah zara, if it's not necessary to be an actual formal ger taishav. Okay. So this was actually basically one example of leis chanim. The leis chanim has multiple meanings, as we're going to see throughout the Perek. So this was number one, to have rachmanos. So that was leimaylan. You can't save them if they're in trouble, and you can't heal them for free or even for schar if there's no pressure. Now we're going to move on to the next form of leis chanim, which is relating to getting property in Eretz Yisrael. Halacha Gimel. Ein meichern laham batim v'sadas b'Eretz Yisrael. So we can't sell houses or fields in Eretz Yisrael. So those are both forms of property, right? So with Syria, meichern ham batim avalei sadas, and in Syria you can sell them houses but not fields. Now Syria is there's a country called Syria now. It's basically that name, that place. It's basically been called that at least since the time of Chazal. In Hilchos Trumas, the Rambam spells out that what's the halachic, what are the halachic boundaries of Syria. So the Rambam says, "Ha'aratz shekavash David chutz la'eretz Canaan." That all the way back in Bayis Rishon, David conquered some areas outside of the boundaries of Eretz Canaan. Aram Naharayim, V'Aram Tzeva, V'Achalab. So those are the three. Those are all three locations that are all associated with Syria nowadays as well. And that's there in Hilchos Trumas. The Rambam explains the whole concept of Syria, that it has certain parameters of Eretz Yisrael, but in certain ways it's not. So that applies to Trumas, stuff like that, and it applies here as well. So at the end of the halacha, we're going to see that really the main issue is really with fields, not with houses. So it seems like the main din, the Iker HaDin, is actually the same in Syria, and Eretz Yisrael, we're adding additional layers on top of it. So and now it continues. What about renting? So you could rent a house in Eretz Yisrael, as long as it doesn't become a neighborhood, a group, a cluster. And that means less than 3 is fine. 3 would be a problem. However, you can't rent.
The third one is not. The third balabos is not allowed to rent them.
Guess so. Yeah.
He has to count. It's 2 and 2, which I'm not allowed to rent them.
Yeah. You can skip apparently as long as it's not 3 in a row.
Not
I
a
think.
cluster. Having more than 3 in one area.
One person, the one person, or is the third person?
Doesn't say, so I guess it's we go after the reality. And you can't rent the fields out at all, because as we're going to see, fields are actually more important than houses. And in Syria you can even give them the field. So to sum up, in Syria, you can't sell fields. That's really the main thing. That's really the main form of the thing. But you could rent the fields out to them, and you could even sell houses to them. And Eretz Yisrael, we go further that you can't even rent out the fields, and the houses you can only rent and only less than 3. That's just to sum it up. So why is Sada more severe? Because it has both mafkiyim and amaisris, b'naisin lem chaniya b'karka. It revokes the chiv of meiser, and it gives them actual hold on the land. From the term echmiru, maybe it sounds like the other way around, that bottom is also part of it, and the chumrah is in Sada, so maybe Surah is only a chumrah. I don't know for sure. This is actually a very right. Apparently, that's not as severe. No, meiser is a big deal. So this is actually a very practical issue nowadays as well. For example, there was a big controversy. Still is about heter mechira. The concept since the 1880s. It's been an issue for a while already. Ever since there was a renewal of Jewish settling in Eretz Yisrael, so you have the issue of Shemitah. And nowadays, a lot of people that just wouldn't be able to handle the whole year of Shemitah. So the idea was, this became an issue already in the 1880s, and they came up with this idea that they're going to sell the Jewish lands in Eretz Yisrael, to a guy for the duration of Shemitah. So that way, once it's the guy's land, so there's no Chiv Shemitah, so you can do whatever you want. Now the problem is, though, that if you go with the assumption that there's no ger taishav, if there was a ger taishav, maybe you could sell land to a ger taishav. That might be an exception. Doesn't spell it out here, but that might be the case. However, if there isn't you can't actually admit the new ger taishav, so then who can you sell it to? It happens to be that there's some who actually even attempted to argue that maybe you could be a ger taishav, and there were some who said you could sell to Muslims in general, and that maybe some achreinim from a few hundred years ago also sold to Muslims, so maybe in practice was considered okay. But going with the more mainstream assumption that there is no ger taishav, so then how are you going to be able to pull off this trick? So that's what the poskim were discussing for decades, to come up with tricks within the trick. You're going to sell it temporarily. That creates new problems. If you sell it temporarily, is it really a valid sale? It's like mechiras chametz a bit. Can you compare it to mechiras chametz? Can you not? So each solution brings new problems. So even though there were some very chashuv poskim who supported this all the way back then, in the 1880s, 1890s, but it's already for many, many, many decades, it's sort of become a split between the more Zionist communities, the Rabbanut, who accept heter mechira, and the Haredim as a whole, who don't accept heter mechira. So they don't eat from those fields, their fields. They do other things. whatever. Also, another practical ramification is regarding to Shleimus Haaretz, because returning land, returning territory, would that be a problem of Leisachanim? So the Rebbe didn't invoke that. Usually, it wasn't his main argument, but there are some places actually where the Rebbe does invoke Leisachanim. I've seen there are other poskim who discussed it and also invoke Leisachanim. It's definitely a central topic in this area as well. The Rebbe, I think, we just prefer to discuss the security aspect as opposed to getting technical about private territory, property. And now to conclude the halacha gimel regarding chutz la'aretz, mutar limkar lambatim v'sodas b'chutz la'aretz v'pnei she'ein artzeinu. But sounds like you can do whatever you want. You can sell houses, fields, and outside of Eretz Yisrael because it's not our land. Sounds like there's no limitations. Because there's other forms of Leisachanim we're going to learn about that are more on a personal level. You're giving the guy a good feeling. But here it seems like, no, it's just purely, are you giving him a hold in Eretz Yisrael or not? If there's no hold, it's fine. Now, it's interesting that if you look in Shulchan Aruch here today, is Siman Kuf Nun Aleph, which is where it deals with these halachas. It brings the halacha of shchuna, the idea of the shchuna that we had just before, separately from the din of Eretz Yisrael. So it says there, "La'yimker v'layasker l'gimel goyim b'yachad b'shchunas haYehudim." You shouldn't sell or rent the three goyim together in a Jewish neighborhood. But you could sell or rent because this is chutz la'aretz. You can even sell to one or two. Kol ma she'yirtza. And you don't have to be concerned that someone will somehow will give it to more. So the Shach there says clearly that what the Shulchan Aruch is talking about is not just Yisrael but chutz la'aretz. And the Taz there says the reason is that we're afraid it's going to cause a sakana. Shema yara sakana liYisrael ma'yadei kach. You're bringing this whole cluster into a Jewish neighborhood. However, the Neiv Yehuda in his comments on the Shulchan Aruch, which are called Dogum Ravava, he comments there that if you look in the Rambam here, it seems like from the order of the Rambam put the detail about Shechuna specifically in the discussion about Eretz Yisrael, and then after that, the Rambam said chutz la'aretz without any limitation, and he seems to be leaning towards that practically. This is also sort of practical, even here in the neighborhoods here where we live here. Look at the Sichas Chelek Vav and the Yisavos Mishpatim, page 250 and on. That's where there's a very lengthy. The Rebbe at the end of the 60s when this became a big issue. So the Rebbe had a very long halachic piece over there. It was based on a Sikha, and they wrote it up and added a lot of just very heavy nigla. I did not see, though, however, that the Rebbe cites this particular halacha. The Rebbe cites other halachas. So, for example, in Chayshemish, but there's a similar halacha also about that if you rent to a guy, that might be considered a nezek to the neighbor. So the Rebbe seemed to go with those halachas. The Rebbe didn't actually quote this particular one. All right.
What's the maskana?
The Sikha, the Rebbe's argument, the Rebbe had a campaign then that it's forbidden to sell. That was the message. That was the point, yeah. Now regarding renting, so now the Rambam is going to add a sort of a limitation to the renting. Even when they said you are allowed to rent, it's actually not so for an apartment. Because he's going to bring Avoda Zara into his apartment, because he brings it wherever he goes. He's moving into this apartment. He brings his Avoda Zara with him. And this is the same pasuk we had in Perek Zion about not having any hana. So we said having hana is a form of bringing it into your house. And here, this is actually not you, but it's your house, and it's literally being brought into your house. So it's also a problem. It's not clear if we're talking about Eretz Yisrael here, because technically that's where the Rambam said, you're mutter to masker, bottom specifically. However, if you follow the Svara, it seems like wherever you live, if it's your house, it would be a problem. So if you look in Shulchan Aruch, same Simon and Isa Kalim there, it also seems like they understood the Pashtos that it's a problem anywhere. So after the Mechaber brings this din, the Ramah comments and says, now we do rent out even for apartments. The Torah says they don't bring a Avoda Zara into their house. Shach says, what are you talking about? I mean, assuming that even if you don't see the Christians are Avoda Zara, but you can there's a way to sort of weave it where they're not Avoda Zara, but the actual accoutrements, the actual stuff they have, the Slumim, if they're Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, they have actual idols, they have actual icons. That should be counted as Avoda Zara. So he says it's doichik to say that it's not, even if they're not, but the idols are idols. So how can you say that it's mutter because they don't bring it in? They do. So he says that maybe, first of all, maybe by the Torah, maybe where the Torah lived, Christianity was practiced differently. Could be they didn't, but where we are, they do. So he says we must be relying on another explanation. The Rosh says, said that, the Torah was quoting the Rosh, but the Rosh also says that the power of renting in the Gentile legal system is more powerful. So, for example, if your own house falls down, you still can't kick the renter out of your other apartment. It's a very powerful kinyan, very powerful contract. So since such a powerful contract, it's almost like a sale. So it wouldn't be considered like it's in your. You can't go in and do whatever you want. So it's not so much like your own place. And he brings another explanation from the Ravan. Similarly, he says because we pay taxes on our property to the government, so do we really truly own the property, or does the government really own the property, and we just have certain rights, but the taxes prove that it actually really all belongs to them, etc. Just an interesting point.
So when the Rambam says that shutfis is mutter for a goy, that doesn't go on being able to deal with them. If it's mutter for a goy already, so how can you say that I'm taking in Avoda Zara?
Much. What case are we? Shutfis of what?
We're renting out to a goy.
Yeah.
So if the Rambam passes that shutfis is mutter for a goy, okay, the Rambam says no. But I'm saying in terms of Europe, so over there it would be nothing wrong to rent out to a goy, because you're not really renting out to somebody. Renting to somebody that has a psak where it's mutter for him to do what he's doing.
So the Shach said that even if you say they're not Avoda Zara, but we would still regard their actual icons and their actual tzlomim as Avoda Zara. It's a doichik to say that because we don't regard them as Avoda Zara, that we wouldn't regard their actual stuff as Avoda Zara.
The crucifix, that's the main.
So yeah, or like I said, the Eastern Orthodox, they have icons, they have images, like there's actual sort of yeah. So the Shach didn't seem to say that he. There are other halachas also regarding davening in front of him. It's a whole many halachas regarding that. But just commenting briefly on it. However, you could rent it out for an eitzer. An eitzer would mean to have tavua, grain, stuff like that. You can use it for storage. The Rabbi comments that, but it can't be wine. And the Kesef Mishnah says, obviously it can't be wine. That's yain nasach. Not avana from yain nasach. We're learning about Hilchos b'chalas asuros. So no, there's no argument over here. That I'm just didn't feel like mentioning it over here. Now, what about? Now I'm going to add another detail about fruit attached to the ground. You can't even sell grain fruit that's attached to the ground because it's a form of it's an extension of the ground. You can sell it once it's cut. Or you can sell, but it has to be just for cutting, and they have to cut it immediately. That way, there's no attachment to the ground. And here the Rambam finally brings the actual pasuk, which is really we've been discussing since the beginning of Halacha Gimel. So one of the ways we teach the word sechanem. So first we said it means loisirachem, and now that I'm saying it's don't give them chaniya, don't let them settle park on the land. So the Rambam is saying it specifically regarding the mechuber, but it's the whole everything we just learned in Halacha Gimel and Daled. If they don't have the land, then it's not chaniya. Chaniya means parking because you're there to stay. If they don't have the land, so then wherever dwelling they're doing is temporary. Now we mentioned this taich of leisachanim. Now we're going to move on to the next interpretation of leisachanim. It's forbidden to speak in their praise. Even to say, oh, how beautiful this guy is. He looks so good. So how much more so to praise their behavior or to be fond of something that is associated with them. Here it's actually the closest to the actual meaning, perhaps. They shouldn't find favor in your eyes. Doing that would lead you to come closer, become more influenced by their bad behavior. The question is, how far does it actually go lamaisa? So, for example, in Shulchan Aruch, in the Kesef Mishnah over here also, same mechaber, he adds that, by the way, if you're praising him, but you mean to praise Hashem, oh, he's so beautiful, Hashem made such a beautiful creation, then it's mutter, which is based on the story in the Gemara, but Gamliel, he saw a beautiful Daisha woman, for whatever reason, and he said praise to Hashem about how beautiful she was. So you see that there's this exception that the Ram didn't mention, but it's mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. There's also discussed, one of the sources in Chazal discusses the famous story about Rabbi Yehuda, who praised the Romans did this, the Romans did that. The continuation of the story we quoted regarding Hilchos and Hilchos Deis, Yehuda ben Gerim, getting Meshum Mechayin Shavot, just by repeating it. So that's part of the discussion. How does that story fit in? Some point out that Rambam himself praises Aristotle for his wisdom, didn't seem to have a problem with that. So I'm not going to claim to give a formula. I'm just going to point out that, like many of the other topics here, there's a whole book, there's a whole monograph called Leis Chanim, and it covers this, it covers the other concept, the forms of Leis Chanim, so you can always look it up there. Another interesting detail that relates to this is in benching. At the end of the Harachmans, we say, "Can you varach Chesanu Kolonu Yachad?" So if you look in all the Siddurim, all the benches, in parentheses, it says B'nai Bris. I don't know if anyone ever said it, but it is there. It's always there. B'nai Bris. The marker is the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, it's before the Alter Rebbe also, but you look in the Alter Rebbe, says you have a guy in the house, so you say Kolonu Yachad B'nai Bris to exclude him from the bracha. She'aseh levarach hanachrim shenamar v'leis chanim. That's leis chanim. That's why it says B'nai Bris in the benching. It says it's better, instead of saying Kolonu Yacha B'nai Bris, to say B'nai Bris Kolonu Yacha, which is how it's printed in the Siddur. So that way, not even for a second, it's not like you said Kolonu Yacha and you included him, and then you say B'nai Bris and you exclude him. You say B'nai Bris right away to exclude him before you had a chance to include him. It says a Nashim Ba'avadim would be considered B'nai Bris, so you're not excluding them. And it says a Meshumad actually wouldn't be excluded either. Very interestingly, if there's a Meshumad in the house, don't bother saying B'nai Bris because you're not excluding him anyway. The earliest source for this is in the Orchos Chaim of the Kolboy, early Sephardi Rishonim. And one of the in Haaretz, number 992 of Alei Torah, Rabbi Chaim Rappaport has a whole shtickle on this about can you daven for goyim in general? If you can't include him in your bracha and benching, so can you daven for someone? Some examples. There's actually an interesting minor from the Rebbe. It was printed recently again in Likut Minus Kodesh of Tafshin and Aleph in 1991. When Yugoslavia was falling apart, so the Slovenians were fighting for independence. That is a country called Slovenia. It was the first to break away from Yugoslavia. So someone actually sent a bracha, asked a request for a bracha from the Rebbe. The Rebbe wrote back, Yedia Shem Aviv, let me know his father's name. Asker b'tfila l'milim mishaleisav l'cheirus amay. I'll mention him to fulfill his desires for freedom for his nation. That's an example where the Rebbe, many other examples, but this is in writing where the Rebbe is saying, I'll be happy to pray for Slovenian independence. So, another interesting topic. Now, regarding the next form of Leis Chanim for gifts, this pasuk is for the Asr. So it's not to give the final form of Leis Chanim is not to give free gifts, which you could give to Ger Teisha, because it says regarding an Avela and Re'eh, regarding the Kashrus, it says you can give it to the Ger, the Ger obviously being a Ger Teisha, so you see when it comes to the Nachri, obviously you're not giving it, you're selling it. So here you see, now do we learn from Leis Chanim or do we learn it from here? Not clear, but it's clearly, the Rambam didn't count it as a separate mitzvah, so it's somehow part of Leis Chanim, but yet the Rambam is bringing another pasuk for it. Now regarding Darkei Shalom. So there's a concept of how there are a lot of exceptions to stuff because we have to live in peace alongside other people. So we support the Gentile poor people along with the Jewish people. We don't exclude them from our tzedakah funds. We let them, we don't stop them from collecting leket shicha and peah. You ask them how they're doing, even on their holiday, which we learned about in the previous parakim about that you really shouldn't give them a reason to thank their God on their holiday, but you have to ask them how they're doing, otherwise we'll be upset. But you can never say shalom twice. That's like a Chazal said, you can't say shalom twice. That's not even on a holiday. And on the holiday, you should not, even if you see him on the street, you should, but if you see him you should not go into his house specifically to say hi. But if you meet him in the market, nice and shalom suffered off of a you don't get all into it. You say it as if you have to, and that's it. Now comes a big clarification. For all of that we said about interacting with Goyim and we're not kicking them out, we're just trying to figure out what you could and can't do. That's when we're among them, or we're not to Yisrael, but they're stronger. If we're stronger, we can't let them stay among us at all. Even temporarily. The Rabbi disagrees with this, but that's what the Rambam holds. Accepts the seven mitzvahs. This is in Mishpatim. Even for a moment. And if you accept the seven mitzvahs, there's a ger toishav, and then I'm adds Ger Teisha was man shayevel naegom, and there was a yevel, there was a basin of Sanhedrin of Shalei Bizman yevel and a Kabbalah like Ger Tzedek Balvad. The Rabbi discussed this in the Likut Sichos, Chavav Yisrei Gimel, but Shem Mitzvahs Bizman Hazeh, how to reconcile this Rambam with the idea that we still have a campaign to get Goyim to observe Shem Mitzvahs. The Rogachover says there's still a framework for being a Shemer Zayim Mitzvahs, even if you can't formally be a Ger Teisha. Right. Who's volunteering for Ma'ariv?